Good morning everybody, and welcome to actually the first public initiative arranged and organized by the Center for Market Education. My name is Carmelo, and I'm the director of the CME. Just a brief introduction. The Center for Market Education is a new unit developed within Ideas. While Ideas is focusing on policy advocacy, in a conversation with Ali, we felt that there was the need to setting up something that was more educational oriented and academically oriented. So we are developing our activity on two fronts, two directions. One is the academia, where we are trying to promote within the econ profession a more realistic, pluralistic, and multidisciplinary approach. So we know that there is a certain delusion about how the discipline developed in the past decades, standardized, homogenized, while there is a higher degree of variety of heterodox schools that are not actually represented within the discipline. So like last month, we arranged a colloquium here in Malaysia with international scholars, in which we discussed and we tried to develop some ideas on the promotion of pluralism within the discipline. The other front is instead the other direction is to develop educational modules that we are going to propose to business people, to students, in particular secondary school students, and to journalists. We want to try to find a way to propose economics to non-economists in a way that can be at the same time rigorous, serious, realistic, but also digestible, in which the main focus is on the relevance of economics for daily life. So economics is not separated from the life of human beings. For this purpose, we are developing a series of papers. The first one was just published last week and is authored by me. The title is Economics, Human Action and Its Meaning. We have a few copies here, but is also available for download on our website, marketedu.org. So it's free from download. In this paper, I try to give a different definition of economics. Okay, we all know that economics is considered as the science of allocation of scarce resources to define ends. I try to bring a different approach. What is economics and what an economist should do. Okay, what's the job of an economist? So you will find my perspective on this point in this paper if you are interested to read. We will have more coming up, not only authored by me, but by other scholars from Malaysia, from outside Malaysia. In the moment, we have a paper under production in Brazil, and one in the UK. We will touch topics like what is entrepreneurship, what are business cycles, which is the method of economics, what is capital, all this we try to answer to all these basic questions that are often given for granted and probably not touched with a realistic approach. So that's all for, this is our website. That's all for the introduction. Later on, we have a form. You can leave your name and your email. So if you are interested to be kept informed of our future initiatives and publications, you can do so. In our team, we have a scientific board, and one of the members, another one is Ali. But we also are appointing fellows to help our effort. Fellows that are not only in Malaysia, but also internationally. And Dr. Christopher Lingle is not only a long-time friend and one of the most wonderful human beings I have met in my life. Really, I'm talking with my heart in hands. Is also one of the most active and vibrant activists in the human freedom movement. Is extensively traveling, so I think if you ask him where does he stay, he doesn't have an answer for this in a traditional sense. He stays where his ideas are required, I would say. So it's really astonishing how he's devoted to the cause of promoting freedom and the individual liberty. He earned his doctorate from the University of Georgia in 1977 and has worked with universities in all the continents except Oceania. So he worked in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, in North America. So there is no place that haven't taken benefit from your expertise. Currently, he's working with the Escuela de Negocios at the Universidad Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala as a lecturer in economics. He's an adjunct scholar at the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, a research scholar at the Center for Civil Society in New Delhi, an international political economy advisor for the Asian Institute for Diplomacy and International Affairs in Kathmandu, a research fellow at Advocata in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and ultimately a fellow at the Center for Market Education in Malaysia. He's one of the one of the greatest experts in Asian affairs, and his book entitled Singapore's Authoritarian Capitalism, Asian Values, Free Market Illusions, and Political Dependency was one of the best sellers, I think, on the Singapore economy a few years back, together with the rise and the decline of the Asian centuries, false starts on the road to the global millennium. So we are very lucky that he's here for a few days. Unfortunately, it's the Chinese New Year weekend, so we couldn't arrange a bigger event, but he's here only over this weekend. So we try to exploit his expertise, and we will discuss with him about a very hot topic, the trade war. We are all very well informed about what is happening between USA and China. Recently, a deal that moderates the tension between US and China was signed. We'll discuss also the potential consequences of this deal. But also, I think it's important for us in Malaysia to understand more something that is always in the air but is a bit unclear. Can Malaysia and in general ASEAN benefit from these trade wars? There are opportunities, or is more a threat for Southeast Asia? So these are the topics that we will try to discuss and debate. So thank you, Chris. First of all, can you give us a brief introduction on the contents and the trade war itself? And I know that you brought with you the International Trade Barrier Index. Maybe you can help us in reading this index and where Malaysia stands in this.
Well, this is a new...
So Chris, can I ask two of you to sit here and this chair? Look better in the photographs later.
Yeah. Good.
It's no empty chairs.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm 1, 2, 3 of the people present here have been my students. So
Okay.
I'm happy.
Yeah. Congratulations to you and to them.
Alish is from Pakistan, so
Okay.
later you will have a chance to know each other.
Well, my welcome last night was quite auspicious. I arrived just before midnight and went for food in Chinatown, and they celebrated with fireworks my arrival. So I want to thank the people of Kuala Lumpur for greeting me in that way. It's become my new favorite destination in Asia. I'd been before many years back. Bangkok had been sort of or Jakarta, and Bali now, been my destination, but now I think I look forward to more time in KL. I was a professor at NUS many years ago in Singapore, and had a very interesting time there. And so I'm familiar with the region. I'm not as up to date as I normally should be, but I have still continue my broad interest in what happens in this part of the world. This International Trade Barrier Index should be of interest to all of you, I think. It's a new initiative by a very active group based in Washington, D.C., the Property Rights Alliance. They also do offer an index on protection of intellectual property rights. So their broad interests began with property rights, and they just started this index this year. Malaysia is one place behind the United States on this index. If you open this index and go to the thing, someone that you met wrote the introduction for this particular project. So it gives an indication of how active countries are in terms of policy to interfere with the free movement of goods and services. So we find a lot of interesting things. Like I say, the United States is number 54, Malaysia is number 55. So the U.S. doesn't score very well because we do have some interferences, primarily on the non-tariff measures. The biggest offenders in this regard are India and China. So some of the complaints against these two countries are valid in the sense that they do not allow a level playing field. Now, my interest in the idea of free trade, following what Dr. Ferlito mentioned, is the human dimension. Free trade is important because of the moral, ethical, and the essential aspects of human liberty. The basic premise of these ideas is that human beings are competent in knowing what's good for themselves, and that outsiders, whether it be government or NGOs, should not be given the power or the right to interfere with lawful exchange that does not injure other people. So this is the basic premise of these ideas that are supported in this index. So it's really a human-centric approach to economics. And I think this is what the Center for Market Education is trying to promote. That we need to understand that trade at its heart, countries do not trade. Individuals or companies trade. And this is one of the mistakes that Donald Trump has made, at least in presenting his ideas on the sort of trade disputes. Because in many ways, at the risk of sounding like I would be supporting him, which I found him to be an extremely problematic character in many different levels. But in some ways, he does have some validity in his arguments. That these countries that he is engaging in these discussions are really going against the basic principles of free trade. Including, I was mentioning earlier, when the United States imports automobiles from Europe, they attract a tariff of roughly 2%. An American car going to Europe attracts a tariff of 25%. So we don't live in a world of pure classical liberal trade. And it is a messy sort of project to try to find a way to allow the advantages of free trade to find their way into the lives of the human beings that occupy our various countries. So this index is trying to give us an indicator, and I think over time it will be a signal as to how governments are moving to improve the lives of their people. Because if there's more free trade, that means that the producers in your countries will have access to the cheapest and best inputs in the production process, so that they will be better able to compete on the global markets and therefore able to export more readily. So this is really, in some ways, the essence of the message of Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations. The primary benefits from free and open trade come from imports, not from exports. Export-oriented policies are nothing more than mercantilism in a new dress. Smith revealed to us that if we import, consumers will access the cheapest and best goods and services from anywhere in the world, which will allow them to have more money left over to buy domestic products, so that this will invigorate the domestic economy. And as I mentioned, producers will have access to the cheapest and best inputs in their production process, making them better able to compete on the global market. So you need to start with allowing imports. Not that you advantage imports, but that you should not try to advantage your exports. Because what will happen then is that you will divert resources from the highest and best uses that are discovered through the spontaneous order of the market. So there's a lot going on in this regard. But if we start with economics as a science of human action, that we're trying to discover how it is that we can make and expand human possibilities within our countries through a policy orientation. So this index will allow us over time to show whether governments are moving in a favorable direction for the best interests of the population or an unfavorable. Another index that's of interest is this Doing Business Index that some of you may know about from the World Bank, which is a similar, after some similar sorts of concepts, showing how easy or difficult, costly, or the ease of opening a business. And these are important indicators of whether or not government policies are allowing people to improve their lives. Because workers need capital, and capital needs labor. These are two complementary, not antagonistic sort of entities. That if the only way you can reduce poverty is through economic expansion. It doesn't come through redistribution. That's a political decision, and it's usually a bad decision. Redistribution is not the solution to poverty. In fact, redistribution in many countries is the source of the problem. That focusing on redistribution interferes with the capacity of the economy to expand, to absorb the people with low skills, and to allow them to develop higher skills, to be more valuable in the economy. So the issue of the trade wars, as we've seen them unfold, are multidimensional. There's a political side where politicians use trade antagonisms as a way of appealing to voting blocks or constituencies. Donald Trump was able to win to be elected partly because he was able to attract the support of industrial workers. They believed, now part of it was that they believed that he reflected their interests in terms of their employment, but also in terms of their way of thinking. One of the big problems, especially in Europe and North America, is that there's a growing sense that the political elite are detached from the interests, the economic interests, the moral interests, the sort of sense of being of the citizens. What in America we call the flyover country. That is the sort of middle class in middle America. So Donald Trump, by appealing to these ideas about these trade antagonisms. Now, his basic beginning point was completely flawed, I believe, at least as he presented it. So he focused on the trade imbalance. That is, America imports too much from China in particular, and China imports too little from America. That's a very simple idea that maybe people can understand. Maybe it would have been more difficult to discuss with the normal population the greater intricacies of trade. So maybe this was not such a bad idea because it's simple to understand, but it's wrong. I have a trade imbalance with Amazon. They never buy anything from me. I have a PhD in economics. Why don't they value me? Now, but I would be an idiot to say, well, look, I'm not going to buy from Amazon because they don't buy from me. Trade imbalances by themselves have no meaning. Antipodean Coffee Shop has a trade imbalance with me. I would be an idiot not to go there because they have good food, good espresso. So this isn't what we focus on. Now, perhaps Donald Trump himself he's not a deeply thoughtful, nor, I'm not even sure he's intelligent, but he has certain abilities to do. He became president of the United States. He can't be a complete idiot, although from time to time he appears to be. But the real issue is that we don't live in a world where all players are playing with the same rules. And that's one of the presumptions that we make about the sort of classical liberal projection of trade relations. You say, well, if everybody plays by the same rules, then we'll have these desired positive outcomes, the net gains from trade. But even in an imperfect world, we're still better off with an approximation to free trade rather than creating barriers. The idea that Malacca, which has one of the best ports and harbors in the world, that if we imagine that Malaysia would be better off by sinking ships in front of the harbor to stop foreign products from coming into Malaysia, would make Malaysia better off, would be an absurdity. Nobody would accept that. But somehow when we say that raising tariffs, which do the same thing, interfere with the entry of foreign products would make Malaysia better off or the United States better off is an absurdity that anyone can understand. So there's a great deal to unravel when it comes to discussing these trade issues. When I was in China, I go every year to lecture there. When the trade war was erupting, initially I was quite surprised at how enthusiastic my Chinese liberal friends were in favor of Donald Trump. I said, wait a minute, how can you see that a trade war will be beneficial to China? He said, oh, well, because it will weaken the economy and weaken the government so that we can get rid of this autocratic monstrosity that occupies Beijing. So for them it was an economic means for a political end. So I was quite surprised by that. And the other interesting thing that I discovered in traversing China and meeting with different groups, how the interest in conservatism among business interests, private business interests, had risen. And I said, why? And he said, well, it's for the same reason. Trump is a Republican, Republicans are conservative, they're against our government, so we want to know more about conservatism as a way to help us advance the interests of the private sector in China. All of this has spawned some interesting political dimensions within China.
Allow me to enter the conversation at this point. You're talking about China, and before you mentioned the possibility to work within a certain system of rules. And an ideal framework behind business. Now, even if, as you know, I'm in favor of free trade, indeed I can understand Trump's argument because of my business experience. So for many years I have done business in China for multinational companies, and when we discuss somehow business in the Western world, but even in this part of the world, there is always behind the acceptance of a certain unwritten rules behind business. So the idea that if you enter the competition, you enter by respecting certain values, and Adam Smith always thought that self-interest is mitigated by the principle of sympathy, so we need other people acceptance. Instead, in China, there is a business attitude which is against the acceptance of these values framework, and an institutional framework that protect this non-acceptance of values. So if in order to pursue my interest I need to kill you, commercially speaking, or I will kill you, and the institutional framework, rather than protecting the person that the business which is a victim of it, protect the aggressor, as far as the aggressor is Chinese. So at what extent is possible indeed to talk about free trade with someone that doesn't accept the basic rules of this free trade?
Well, it's the same thing in a sense. The same problem exists in Russia as in China in this regard. Their grand experiments with communism destroyed the idea of the rule of law. And the rule of law is this emergent sort of interaction of human beings where you begin to understand within this framework of an economic system that there are only three basic obligations that we have to each other. And they're mutually beneficial. They're not obligations in the sense that I have to give up something without a compensation. But that you keep your promises, fulfill your contracts. That you do not engage in aggression, unwarranted or unprovoked aggression against anyone else. And that you respect the private property of others. Now, in the communist experiments, private property went out the window. Contracts had no meaning because you have a collectivist, authoritarian regime where contracts don't exist. You must do. That's not a contract. So what we're seeing is that China is still behind in that regard, as is Russia. Malaysia, of course, you have a sense of the rule of law. There are remedies for violations of contract. There's an understanding of contract. There are remedies for violations of private property. There are remedies for acts of violence to protect you against. Now, so this is really, in a sense, in absence of a global appreciation for the rule of law. And of course, what we're seeing increasingly, unfortunately, in much of the West, Western Europe, North America, governments are, through legislation, weakening the rule of law. Because the rule of law means the absence of privilege. But most legislation that we see in most democratic representative countries, the legislation involves the creation of privilege by granting a subsidy to give free education to university students. But that's a privilege. That imposes a financial obligation to you without compensation. So I think really what's at heart here that in order for us to understand the fundamental problem in China with these relationships, that we start with this idea of the rule of law. And until China, as a country, develops institutions that support the rule of law, the Communist Party, the membership in the Communist Party, is the way that you solve your problems. And in fact, as you probably know, around 5% of the population of China are members of the Communist Party. It's the best and the brightest. It would probably be, if you were Chinese, you would all be invited to membership. They spot people at schools and universities, or people that become successful in business, they bring them in. Now,
But indeed, I remember I had some students when I was teaching that were coming from mainland China, and this mentality is so pervasive that when I discussed free trade, not only free trade, but even individual freedom of action, the answer that they were giving is, yeah, these are nice ideas, but we Chinese are like that, so it's good if the government control us, because we are not good to be free.
Yeah.
So they accept government control because they are so brainwashed that government convince them that they are not good individuals, and then they need to be controlled. This is quite scary, in particular when you hear it from 20 years old people that should be the ones that care more about individual freedom. Then comes my next question to you. Might eventually, indeed, like your Chinese friends said, what Trump is doing, coming out to be the best, even from a free trade perspective, in the sense that if gradually China gets more isolated from a business perspective, so more closed, they don't find outflow, they don't find any more markets for their product, they would be eventually forced to think, what's wrong with our model? Maybe we need to push in a different direction. So maybe for the good of free trade, we should be even more radically protectionists against China in this moment to force them to move in a different direction? I mean, just to play a paradox, but probably that is probably the reasoning that your friends are making.
Well, unfortunately, the escape valve for China is the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, where they are consolidating through favorable lending terms or whatever to expand their influence both politically and economically globally. I think one of the faults in that logic, perhaps, although I find some sympathy with that and with my friends in China, there was a misconnection. If we really wanted to weaken the regime, it would be through the weakening of the state-owned enterprises. But in fact, that's not what's happening. The impact of the trade war is on the private sector, the most vibrant sector of the economy, which, again, is the sector that we would want to support, because we would see there this sort of idea that this would be an expansion of this contract culture within the context of China, where people would begin to understand the importance of contracts and respecting property rights. But in fact, they're being weakened, and more resources are being directed through the Belt and Road Initiative to the state-owned enterprises, which is, again, a big problem. That also, on one level, is not a bad thing, because if it does promote more global trade, then on one hand that's a good thing. But if it allows China to expand its political control over the policy directions of these countries that, including Italy,
Yes.
where it's made arrangements to utilize this Belt and Road development, that could be somewhat more problematic. So, again, as we see here, the levels and layers of what's going on here are much more than meet the eye. I mean, you have to, as you dig deeper into this, there are reasons to be optimistic about the outcomes of these trade conflicts. It might have been possible that in the hand or mind of another president, he could have packaged it in a different way. But on the other hand, that wouldn't have been Donald Trump. And there may be an advantage here, too, in the fact that people are unsure. It's sort of like in a poker game, like in a card game, where you're gambling. If you don't know anything about the other guy, you're more cautious. Trump, people don't know what his next move will be. They don't know if he'll get more aggressive or less aggressive. So it's like in a business negotiation. You have the other partner or other party is always off balance because they don't know what to expect from you. So it may be that there's something by accident in his insanity that makes Donald Trump.
This is very interesting, because this might be insanity or might be genius, because the border is always very, very, very thin. But indeed, while the liberal elites tend to make a joke of Trump, and in fact, like they make a joke of the Brexit, and they get slapped at elections, because indeed you win in democracy when you can attract the interest of the people. So Trump, like Boris Johnson, and these people are talking the language of the people, so we don't have to underestimate that as far as we accept the democratic rules, and they are touching topics that are felt by the people, while the traditional elites are unable to discuss that. They are lost in a different conversation that is good only for the elite newspapers and not for the people. So coming back to Trump, indeed he surprised everybody with what happened in North Korea.
Yeah.
And South Korea, in the end, it seemed to be the monster, the aggressive monster, but in the end, it drove a process, an historical process of what happened between North and South Korea. And again, when the heat of the trade war was getting warmer and warmer, came out with a new agreement.
Yeah.
The agreement that was signed last week,
Yeah.
$200 billion value. So this unpredictability is probably playing in his favor, because somehow it seems that he's able to create a tension and to come to be the man that solved the tension as well. So it's very interesting to see how he's playing these chess moves. How do you interpret, how do you read this latest agreement that was signed? Which are the potential consequences? It's like if he said to China, listen, I'm able to flex my muscle. I see that America can be independent. And then when I decide at my pleasure, I come to you and I open the doors again. So how do you read this?
Well, it's all about election and re-election. One could almost suggest that the Chinese want Donald Trump to be re-elected, in the sense that they've actually handed him at least good headlines for the newspapers, that he actually got a response. Now, again, if you open up that agreement, it's like a lot of international blah, blah, blah. There's no enforcement mechanisms, there's no guarantees, and so on. And the Chinese, promises of more imports, again, how do you enforce that? I mean, in any way, why would you want that? I mean, to compel the Chinese people to buy things that they don't need is foolish. But to allow them to choose what they want to buy, that might make sense. I mean, that may be part of what's going on here. But so that new agreement is only positive on the surface. I'm not sure how things will unravel, but there's an election in 10 months. This makes him look like a strong leader. He's a deal maker, and I think it plays very favorably in his re-election chances. And he's not foolish in that regard. He certainly knows that this will, and especially in those states where he has to win. These are industrial states, and these are plain people. They're not university educated people like in this audience. These are people that deal with daily problems, that worried about their kids in school and things like that. And they don't think in these high levels of abstraction that politicians often discuss. He speaks to their heart. He speaks to their daily lives. So he's a certain genius in that regard. He understands that part of it. But I think it's just who he is. I don't think it's all political artifice. I think it's just who he is. These other, like other politicians, they're politicians. This guy's a businessman. The interesting thing about the American Republic, it was in the image for politics in the 18th century was not professional politicians. It was this citizen who would stand up, serve the country, and go back to what they used to be doing. Farmers, business, whatever. But of course, what's happened over time, same in Malaysia, everywhere in the world, we have professional politicians. And we've become accustomed, and diplomats, we've become accustomed to this sort of, normal procedure and how you negotiate and how you arrange things. And now we have this, Donald Trump is, in a way, what was imagined was the way democracies would be run. It would be someone who would stand up at a certain moment, do what they were able to do, and then go back. Because Donald Trump will go back to being a businessman. That's his instinct. But if Hillary Clinton went back to being a politician when she lost. They're professional. That's their life. That's all they. So these people are off balance by someone who doesn't do what they do and doesn't do it in the way they do it. With diplomacy, Donald Trump doesn't trust diplomats. He doesn't need them. I'm a businessman. I don't need a diplomat. I negotiate with you. I don't ask my ambassador. I might get the introduction, but probably don't need the ambassador for the introduction. We're business interests. We go directly to each other. So he's outside of that. And that makes him more complicated for them to deal with because he's less predictable in how he deals with North Korea. He calls up the guy and says, let's meet. Huh? You didn't ask the ambassador for that. That's not the normal channel. So
it reminds me of Berlusconi in my country.
Yeah.
That's similar.
For good and for bad.
Yeah, for good and for bad. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's move a little bit forward and come closer to Malaysia. There has been a lot of talking in this region that the trade war, so by somehow isolating China, can create opportunities for FDIs and so for more growth and more initiatives in Southeast Asia. But beyond the talking, there is not much action. It seems like investors are a bit on a wait and see.
Yeah.
Still before understanding, even if indeed the process for some multinational companies to leave China and to move towards Southeast Asia is already dating back 6-7 years, because the business environment is more friendly, even if labor can be more expensive at a certain extent. But how do you see? It's difficult, I think, to talk about ASEAN, because indeed there is no united identity in ASEAN. There is more competition between Vietnam and Malaysia, in example, rather than cooperation on attracting investments. So, do you really think that there are opportunities, and if yes, how can these opportunities be played and attracted, or do you see instead a net loss for everybody on these, or a mix of the two?
Well, of course, there's several levels again here. The initial response is merely shadow play, where you would change the invoicing. So you would arrange for a company in ASEAN with a base in ASEAN to be the origin of these products that would go to the United States to escape. So the Chinese company, either through ownership or through arrangements of some sort, just re-invoice. So this was a kind of a shadow market arrangement. So that doesn't create direct benefits, except maybe to only the parties involved, which may be in bribery and corruption, or simply sort of a shuffling of cards somehow. The next step would be the real direct investment, where either multinationals that might have situated in China decide instead that other countries provide a more attractive overall environment. So this creates an opportunity, a big opportunity for Malaysia in particular, or ASEAN countries in general, to open their economies even more. Because this will invite the attention of the potential foreign direct investment and including Chinese investors, that instead of producing in China, realizing that they'll have a clearer path to market by investing, either buying through greenfield investments or purchasing Malaysian companies. So this would be the next stage. But this creates an opportunity for governments to be alert to the possibility that they can make policy decision that would invite some of this potential investments. So the threats are, of course, would be where you would be suppliers to China, especially to the private sector, where, because their growth has been dampened or lessened through the pressures of this trade war up till now. But it seems that, again, for most economies in ASEAN, you're not that dependent on exporting to China per se. So I think those effects are much less than they might have been. But here's the big opportunity. I mean, you need to be alert to the fact that that Malaysia, for example, could be, and this would be a restoration of Malaysia's position as an industrial and manufacturing center that was the beginning of the boom of the globalization period for Malaysia. And it would reinvigorate that sector. So this would be an area for policymakers to be very much interested in.
Yeah, indeed. But what we see here, unfortunately, is more talking than action. Okay. Malaysia has programs to attract multinational companies. However, they are limited to very big companies that decided to set foot here with huge operations. Probably a step, and this is something that probably also as ideas we might think as an area of work, is to rethink the system of incentives in Malaysia to include more also medium-sized multinational companies that decide to set a foot here, because with globalization we are not anymore in the time in which only companies, let's say like Siemens or the big manufacturing companies also decide to set a foot in Asia. Now more and more companies are moving, setting up offices and operations on a medium or small scale. And indeed a good package of incentives for them might be an option, together with, I think, also a plan of incentives for local entrepreneurs. This is something that often is complained by the local business community. You do a lot to attract people from abroad, but if we do the same as locals, then we don't benefit the same incentives. So we should look at a more coordinated effort in which foreign investments and local business play more together rather than in competition.
You know, I've never been a supporter of special economic zones or free trade areas, because you give advantages to foreign companies that you don't give to your own. You allow rich and big companies from rich countries to have privileges that are not accessible by your own. Doesn't make sense. The whole country should be a free trade area, because this is the way you should make your country attractive for domestic investors, so that foreign investors say, oh, there's something happening there. I want to come. It's not that I'm bribed to come. So start with that focus. And unfortunately, big government likes big business. You and I can meet, you treat me very respectfully, I treat you respectfully. Small businesses, I don't have time for you. I'm busy with my business. I don't need to talk to you. And I come in my dirty shoes and, you know. Government officials don't like small business. They're a nuisance. There are too many of them. But Siemens or pharmaceuticals, we have a meeting in the 5-star hotel and we have a nice lunch, or, you know. So, human-centric economics. Make your country attractive. Look at the Doing Business report. How much does it cost? How many steps are there to open a small business? What are the taxes? What are the, the capital requirements? In Hong Kong, to start a business, you fill out, it takes maybe 5 minutes. You fill out a card. They don't want to know how many people you're going to employ, how big is your signage, how many square meters, how many forms. No, you fill out one form. They want your address so they can send you a tax bill. Now that's a sensible approach. I mean, I don't like taxes, but if you're going to be running a government, it's a sensible approach. Get them into business quick so they can pay taxes. A system of government that's based on redistribution, they don't focus on growth. You need to focus on growth. Make it easy to start businesses, then foreign investors will come. Now, labor costs by themselves are less important than the other barriers and burdens of doing business. And that's where the free trade zones come in. They cut away all of that for foreigners, but not for the domestic investor. You're still stuck. That's why you have slower growth in many of these countries. And what we find is that in poor countries, it's much more expensive to open a business than in rich countries. Look at Hong Kong. It depends on how many people in front of you in the queue. It could take up to 5 minutes to open a business. Whereas in a poor country, it could take decades to be, you start your business and then you start the process. You just try to stay under the radar screen. But then that keeps you, small. You can't expand. It's harder to. And if you can't get a business license, you might not be able to get a bank loan to expand your business. So, but again, politicians are too busy in that negotiation at the 5-star hotel with the multinational company. They don't care about the small guys. This is human-centric economics. Care about how people actually live their lives, how they open a business, how they solve their problems through, I want to enrich myself. And in doing so, I enrich my community. Not by giving a privilege to some foreign company. So the whole country should be a free trade zone.
For everybody.
For everybody. But why would you give an advantage to a foreign company you don't give to your own people? That goes against democracy. And it goes against the rule of law. Privileges violate the rule of law as a general concept. So we need to move away from the politics of privilege to a human politics, where humans, all of us, equal, women, men, regardless of religion, whatever, are seen in the same way. Human beings. Value people in their humanity rather than in their sort of peculiarities.
Well, last question before we open to the floor, because I'm sure our guests have some question. The classical fortune teller question. How do you see is this trade war going to end? We have elections coming. We have different pressures in different directions. How is going to end this process, and how do you see Also, according to the outcome of the American elections, how do you see the situation evolve? Supposing Trump is going to win, or supposing the Democrats are going to win, how is it going to affect the trade war?
Happily, for me, I don't pay much attention to what goes on in U.S. politics, partly because I have no comparative advantage. You know, I am more interested in what goes on in Asian politics because I have a comparative advantage. Many of my audiences know, certainly in the West, know less than I do. So I don't spend a lot of time engaging in discussions about American politics in particular. But in terms of the trade war, the optimist in me sees perhaps an accidental advantage in some of Donald Trump's stupidities, some of these that we discussed. That it's made people aware that, look, there are consequences to bad policies, or to policies that are creating privileges for domestic producers that aren't available to others. So if it stimulates that kind of policy debate, I can see some optimism. People say, and we've seen it happen. One of the problems with trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements, is that they're all about exclusions to free trade. They wouldn't be 2,000 pages if they were. I mean, if it's free trade, said we're going to trade with each other. You don't need more than one page for that. But if you've got 2,000 pages, that means you've got this advantage, you've got this advantage, you've got this privilege, you've got that. So as long as that is the process. Now, if Donald Trump interrupts that process, where special interests are able to create their own privileges within these trade agreements, business as usual. But if we begin to see blocking those special interests, so like American trade unions are terrified that Malaysian workers who are better at doing what they do in America can produce it faster and whatever, that they say, well, we'll trade Malaysia, but you've got to have more labor regulations that raise your costs of labor, which almost inevitably will raise your unemployment rates because all these labor regulations interfere with the hiring of labor and the capacity of new labor entrants to develop skills. So they're almost never to the advantage of the other country. Environmental regulations to satisfy an environmental interest in Chicago will create obstructions to opening a business in Malaysia where the conditions are different. The people in Chicago can afford to have both the high environmental standards and be able to produce. Whereas in Malaysia, you never open your business if you're fulfilling the same technical requirements and cost obligations. It'll guarantee that you won't have economic growth because of these kind of regulations and interferences. Taxes, the tax structure. What makes a country attractive for foreign and domestic investors? How easy is it to open a business? Well, if you have free trade zones, easy for multinationals, but not so for locals. The tax structure. Are you able to keep most of what you earn so that you can reinvest your profits to grow your business, or transfer them to the state where they'll be squandered or lost to corruption or to waste or simply to fulfill some electoral promises. Labor regulations that make it difficult to hire and fire labor. You know, in many European countries, at one time in Spain, if you hired someone for 1 day full-time and you went bankrupt, you would have had a legal obligation to pay that person's salary for 3 years, even though you're no longer operating. So there were no full-time jobs. Everybody was hired part-time. So you dance around it. You know, but this creates, so if you're part-time, you don't get the benefits that are associated with full-time employment. So unemployment rates in Spain were 25%.
It's the same case, probably this is
Italy.
crazy Mediterranean, where the law for employees in Italy is so strict. Basically, nobody can be fired unless you are caught cutting the throat of one of your colleagues. Then basically nobody's hired anymore. Everybody's working as a contractor.
Yeah.
So you work as an employee, so 10 hours a day, but you have to issue an invoice to your employer. You don't have a payroll. So there are no obligations. The moment in which the company says, okay, listen, enough. But this is forced by too restrictive law and almost 100% taxation of employees. So if you get net in pocket 1,000 euros, the cost of for the employer is 2,000 euros. So these kind of things are forcing people out of business.
And that's the good news in a way. I mean, if you go to Europe, if you lived on the moon and you looked at the macroeconomic data, Europe you would imagine Europe would be an underdeveloped region. But you go there, and it's because the market works. The government is outside of the market in some ways. The government has pushed the market underground. So that Italy's GDP is understated by at least 25%. So it's a much more prosperous country.
The black economy.
Yeah. So, and that's the problem. Macroeconomics never gives you a clear indication of anything, except what politicians want to do with it. Macroeconomics is an abomination. It was the worst thing that ever happened to economics. Microeconomics is where human beings live. Macroeconomics is an abstraction for politicians to talk about trade imbalances, unemployment rates. These are abstractions. We don't know. They're not objective measures. GDP, I don't know what it is.
Indeed, just to comment on this, and then we open the floor to come back to China. And probably some of you have studied economics, but I leave you a simple flash on what Chris said about GDP and GDP as an abomination. When I was used to travel a lot to China, I traveled a lot in north, the border with Mongolia, in an almost desert region. And the government built their huge, beautiful, empty highways, 8 lanes, okay? So when the government spend money for building that highways, you know how GDP is calculated. So government spending is a positive element of GDP. In the moment in which government spends the money for that highways, the GDP goes up and everybody is happy. But nobody is looking at the consequences of this. So is this investment bringing any return? Who's going to pay for it in the future? How was financed? So these micro considerations behind the aggregate. So the fact that the GDP goes up in itself doesn't mean anything. That's why we don't need to get very much impressed on the statistics on Indian or Chinese GDP. Look at how that data is built and which are the components. The same, I don't remember who said recently that Malaysian GDP for 90% is made by private consumption. It's an issue. Where are the investments?
Yeah.
But these are okay, just keep it there for your own reflection. Now I think
another aspect of how anti-human those measures are. If you look at per capita income for a fixed level of GDP, if you have another baby, per capita income goes down. Bad. It's bad. A baby is the most valuable thing in your family. I hope maybe your father's golf clubs are more important, but for most people, Their children are the most valuable possession. But to the macroeconomists, you know, if you build a highway that's of no use, that's a good thing. But if you have another child, oh, you're creating a problem. You're reducing per capita income. And again, that drove population policies for a long time, that sort of anti-human mentality. And we're living, China's living with the consequences of that. India too.
Okay, I think it will be interesting. Thanks, Chris, for this enlightening introduction. And I think that it will be interesting to listen from the floor. If you have any question or you need any further
I don't hear very well, so you may have to speak, or I may approach you if I can't hear you. So
speak loudly.
yeah.
So Belt Road initiatives, as you mentioned before,
sorry?
Road initiatives, as you mentioned before, would give China more access to broader markets. So yes.
Okay.
So would it give China a leverage in future if the trade war doesn't de-escalate?
It's interesting. I mean, as I mentioned, in a way, it's a way for them to escape. Except that the U.S. is such an important market at the moment. But over time, if China is successful in promoting this bridge and road initiative, it's the perfect outcome of globalization. For me, again, it's several levels. It's a Keynesian nightmare where it's only about keeping the state-owned enterprises alive. But on the other hand, the benefit might actually be, in the longer term, to expand this globalization process, which has been the most beneficial human activity in the last century, to reduce poverty, absolute poverty, to such a low level. The tragedy of the success of globalization is that it's created a straw man, an imaginary evil called the billionaire. It's seen as though one of the American politicians said, you don't make $1 billion, you take $1 billion. Now, that is the mentality of a 16th century thinker who had not engaged in this idea that voluntary exchange creates wealth on both sides of the transfer. That trade is never, I get rich at your expense. You are made better off because you decide to do so. So what's happened is that, again, this creates a political opportunity. Instead of seeing globalization as a friend of the extremely poor, creating opportunities that were never available, the possibilities that some people become billionaires and that's wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. If I'm the best Huitiao producer in Chinatown, I make good money. If I'm the best in KL, I make a lot of money. If I'm the best in Malaysia, I make money. If I'm the best in the world, I become a billionaire. It's not my fault. It's the market allows me to do that. And you, by buying from me, are at fault. No, you're not at fault. You didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. I don't even know how I got $1 billion. The market did that for me. I just did what I do. I do it well, and you reward me for it. So unfortunately, what's happened politically, we've begun to see this, instead of applauding globalization as the friend of the poor, taking people out of immense poverty, we focus on the wrong thing. It's envy, or it's not really envy. It's you're a milk cow. If I become a politician, I use that image of you as a bad person as an excuse to take away from you so I can spend on creating privileges and be reelected. So it's an evil political game. But globalization, if that Belt and Road Initiative expands the opportunity for globalization, it's only a good thing. And we need to get past this destructive narrative that being a billionaire is a bad thing. Being a billionaire is a wonderful thing. It shows that the market works for everyone, including the poor, because they will have access to jobs and to products and services that they would never have access to. When I, looking around the skyline here, that's the story. Why are we focused? Why is Oxfam? I mean, this is a great irony. The people who are in Davos right now, shouting at billionaires, and they themselves are occupying space in the most expensive country in the world. I don't know how they got there. They're not working. And they're saying, you need to give other people more of your hard-earned money. Who are they to say that? And what gives them the capacity to be there to be able to do that? I mean, all these demonstrators saying, tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich. They all look rich to me. They're all out having these expensive, things from Gap or wherever, or Eddie Bauer or wherever how did they get there? And why aren't they at work somewhere? But they want more of what other people have. Yeah, anyway, sorry, I got sidetracked a little bit there, but Ali?
Yeah, just going back to your statement earlier on in the talk when you said the trade happens between the individuals and the enterprises and not the governments. Mm-hmm. And I would want to believe that, definitely. But at a practical level, like trade policy, when trade policy actually happens, mm-hmm. negotiations actually happen between, let's say, two countries. Obviously, the firms are also interacting. But I think we do see a role of Ministry of Trade, actively pushing the interests of their countries and etc. So last week, for instance, the Malaysian Minister for Primary Industries, Teresa Goh, was in Pakistan actually, and in an edible oil conference. And I was reading the statement that she was interviewed, and so she was asked a question from the manufacturers or the refinery mills of oil in Pakistan, that they want Malaysia to export more of crude palm oil, not refined palm oil. And the minister was saying that Malaysia has moved away from exporting crude palm oil. They extract and they refine it on the shore. So about 90% of Malaysian palm oil is refined in Malaysia and then exported. But here is a set of Pakistani business firms who have set up their refineries, and their interest lies in importing cheaper refined palm oil so that they can then refine and earn value. But here's the Malaysian minister, the government is saying, sorry, I'm not going to do that. So they're asking favor, or they're asking, demanding her to ask the Malaysian industry, which is also, by the way, quite dominated by the government, to let it happen. So I was like, struck. I was thinking, so there's a heavy role of the government here in setting the trade direction in the future. Let's see in this case of palm oil between the two countries. How would you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a classic case. When I teach public finance and public choice economics. I have what I call Lingle's, my family name, law. That government intervention creates a distortion. That creates a demand for government intervention. That creates a distortion. That creates a demand for government intervention. So this is a classic case. The fact that the government is involved with palm oil production, either subsidizing it or providing tax incentives and so on, and that it may have provided tax incentives for palm oil refining, that it creates this distortion. Now here the market solution would be that the palm oil refiners in Pakistan would have negotiated with the palm oil producers directly, but they're probably not able to because there's several layers of bureaucracy that they might have to go through to be able to get there. And then they may have said, well, it's probably not a good investment for palm oil refining. You know. But they may have invested because the government of Pakistan said, oh, if you refine palm oil here, we'll subsidize you. You know, we'll provide you. So, again, it's difficult to deal with these problems because they almost all, the solution to the problem is that government steps back at various stages. And how do you get that? Well, these free trade agreements are always about, again, the pressures of, and it's not only business, don't forget. They're the NGOs, they're the labor interests, the trade union interests, which are not labor interests necessarily. So these agreements are all about, I want a privilege, and I want the state to provide it. And I will give you my political or my financial support if you provide that. So, in a way, it's the solution to all these problems is the retreat of the state. In many ways, how do you get there? It's very complex. Well, the only way I can see getting there is through educational process, and this is what we're committed to. I try to convince people like you in hopes that you will convince other people that this is the way, and this is a long-term project. I've been doing this for 50 years. I committed my life to trying to promote these ideas. Small groups like this, larger groups sometimes, but we got to start somewhere. I have to be I've always been optimistic that the next generation will do a better job than I did. They'll reach more people, that you'll articulate the ideas in a better way than I do to convince people that it's all about promoting the quality of human life. This is what politics should be. Politics should be a way for us to solve problems that we all share. Okay? Not to create privileges for the benefit of some at the expense of others. If we get politics and democracy, we're again getting a little bit sidetracked. We're at a really dangerous moment. In a way similar to what happened in the 1930s. Democracy has become our potential enemy. Because what's happened is that it's become a battleground over privilege. The reason we're seeing so much violence, except in Hong Kong perhaps, which is more of a political motivation. But if you look at Chile, Lebanon, a lot of other places, where you're seeing people fighting each other and the police in the streets, really what's at stake is that I want more of what you have, and you're not giving me enough. And I want the political system to deliver it. So politics through democracy becoming a redistributive game is dividing people. And democracy as an instrument of privilege assignment divides us. And the elite doesn't see that. They want to do more of it. They say, oh, no, it's about redistribution. No, but that's the beginning of the problem. It's when democracy became a system of redistribution rather than a guarantor of human liberty that it went wrong. So I think I'm really worried because the elite, the political elite, wants to do more of the same. They don't see themselves as part of the fault in what we're seeing. They say, no, give us more power, give us more resources so we can create more privileges, more subsidies, and divide people more. Create more anger, resentment, divisions, class struggle. This is what gave us the 1930s and then all the upheavals that came out of it.
To come back to Alice's question, I think that one thing that you mentioned before is a useful answer. You said before, big government likes big business. In fact, you mentioned an industry which is big and plays a very important role in the Malaysian economy.
Sure.
But if we look at the generality of business, where less big interests are involved, indeed, it happens precisely what Chris said. What Chris said. It means multinational companies or suppliers or whatever, international companies, they just go look for their customers and meet business partners in the market within the institutional framework, without government setting or deciding anything. But the dangerous thing, probably for the generality of the economy of what you have mentioned, is that of course this big business has a spillover effect. So many of the smaller scale businesses operate for the big business, so in the supply chain of the big business. And if the big business create the impression that in order to get business and to get profit, you need political connection rather than entrepreneurial skills, you create also a spillover effect on this perception. So the business affair becomes more a protection affair at each level, and this is very dangerous because also we have to clarify the misunderstanding that business people are market people. Business people rightly want to make a profit, and if at a certain point there is a perception that the better way to make a profit is not to engage in the market but to engage with politicians, then we corrupt the whole people, the whole economy. And if the government start to be heavily involved at a higher level, there is really the risk of a big domino effect. And this is probably what happens with the Belt Road Initiative of China, which is very dangerous under many perspectives, in particular on the fact that the country that benefit of these loans are becoming somehow economically dependent from often not economically sound initiatives financed by China. Look at what happened with the airport case in Sri Lanka, where they built an airport out of nowhere, thinking that this airport will become the new Colombo airport. But Colombo airport heavily needs an improvement, is one of the worst airports in Southeast Asia. While instead of improving Colombo airport, which is the capital city, they built another airport, which now has an average of 2.5 passengers per day. Okay, and who is going to pay for it? Again, so this is one level of the dangerous way of China doing business with the government involvement, like a government-driven business, and as a consequence comes the fact that the private business will enter the mentality that they want to get contracts with this. So they need to be the airport. I want the one supplying the concrete. I want to be the one supplying electronic and whatever. So you create all of a drug-dependent business that is financed not by economic considerations but by geopolitical considerations. And in the long run, this will create a lot of damages to the economies that now seems to benefit from the Belt and Road initiatives. And Pakistan is probably another country that might suffer.
Of course, what happens is the Chinese go and they create advantages for the leadership.
Sorry, another question?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
One here.
So based on what you said just now, like the interaction of the government in the business itself. So because I read a lot on the trade issue right now, one of the things that the media doesn't show is that most of the media showing right now is what Donald Trump are doing is a bad thing for the globalization. But based on all the evidence that we just stated and now the involvement of the government, like the Road Belt initiatives, and we could say that what is Donald Trump are doing right now is foreseeing the future of the globalization, saving the globalization issue itself. So because I put a critical thinking on what is Donald Trump doing and what is the China doing right now. So based on the action by the Donald Trump side right now, we see that the economy in USA is on a good path. They have S&P 500 is on a good way. The unemployment rate also is in the best precedence in the past decade. So as economists, we are wondering, is Donald Trump right in this issue? Or this issue is just temporary and just another crazy thing that he was doing? Or this is the issue that all the government should concern? Because in this trade issue, we see that China is suffering and all the allies of China is now having slow growth. So what is your opinion on that?
Yeah. The question then really, in a sense, becomes what's more important, intentions or results? And as I said, Donald Trump is a bad advocate of his own position. He makes a mess of things. He can't articulate well and gives contradictory, sometimes, intentions. But if you look at the results, they seem to be impressive.
Because I talked with some traders, they said that in order to understand Donald Trump, we should not understand he as a politician.
Yeah, exactly.
We understand Donald Trump as a businessman.
Yeah,
so we can get the result.
Yeah,
so that's why somehow, even though we can say that the trade war is happening, but why the foreign investor don't come to Asian country as a substitute for China? Because they say that we don't invest in temporary fix. We invest in the long term. They have some belief in what Donald Trump doing. So this is put some what we call some stress to the countries that already involved in the Belt Road Initiative. So especially in Malaysia, we cannot take back our connection with China. So.
Which is not necessarily bad. Indeed, of course, you have to consider on the last part that you said that this investment from China going somewhere is not something that can happen overnight. When we talk about capital, invested capital, we are talking about something that is difficult to move. It takes a long time to be reshaped, and we're talking about heterogeneous capital. Capital is always heterogeneous, so a definition of capital as an amount doesn't exist. So it doesn't mean that you have set up a restaurant, the restaurant failed, and you can use whatever in the restaurant to set up a car salon. Okay, so it's easy again for macroeconomists to talk about reshuffle of capital or reswitching of capital, but the reality is that capital is heterogeneous and cannot be reshuffled. When something goes wrong, in most cases, capital is simply destroyed. So if you have a factory that now is suffering in China, it's not that easy to say, okay, I just go to Malaysia or to Vietnam. Well, it's a lot of consideration, investment, and it's a process that takes time, and in this process, of course, political consideration also comes into place. So Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand can be alternatives to China. But in this context, how political uncertainty plays a role. And I think in this moment, probably what is penalizing more Malaysia in terms of FDI's traction is political uncertainty. Because this is my personal belief, so don't take it as a revealed truth. But there has been a lot of excitement for the result of G13, the first change in the political environment over 60 years. And what was good, was healthy. Political system need change. However, probably there were too high expectations on the change that politics can bring into the economy. The fundamental of the Malaysian economy are precisely the same the day before Najib and the day after Najib. The economy doesn't change in one night because you replace a politician. There's a process that takes decades, and moreover, the greatest responsibility in the change is in the way in which people do things, not in the way in which politicians do things. And now that that change had happened, probably the direction in political economy that the Malaysian government is taking is not that clear. We have one day saying, as we discussed a few days ago, it's not government business to do business. The day after, there is an action that is contradicting that statement. Or even at a more general level, the lack of clarity on the eventual passage of power between Mahathir and Anwar is going to happen, is happening when. These are all uncertainties that weigh a lot on investment decisions, and this is even more important than whatever Bank Negara decided to do on interest rate. We just discussed with Ali exactly this point, because as investors, you look at the general conditions of the country. Interest rate plays a very limited role if there are no profit expectations, because what drives your decision is profit expectations. However low is the interest rate, if you don't expect a profit from your investment, you're not going to do it. And the climate of uncertainty over the general direction of political economy by the new government is probably weighing more as an obstacle in making Malaysia having that alternative role to China in attracting federal direct investment, even if I believe there are in this government people that has good ideas, but these people remain always a little bit in the shadow because strong leaders tend to obscure smarter people behind.
I have a question that is a bit out of the topic, but still on Trump. One of the first things that Trump did was to withdraw from the PPA when he came in. So what is your take on that?
Well, like I said, in general, free trade agreements are not about free trade. So I would be happier if he would stay out of such an arrangement if he unilaterally opened the U.S. economy to more free trade. It might have been to the advantage, and of course it hasn't been settled yet completely, right? I mean, there's still outstanding issues about all of that. But I'm not a great fan of free trade agreements. That is the primary thing. I'm a great fan of free trade.
Free trade is probably more free if there is no agreement.
Yeah.
Simply there is nothing written and we can just trade.
Thousands of pages.
Which is not possible.
Yeah, it's just thousands. And so, in a way, again, this is why you could almost imagine a conspiracy theory against Trump. That people who are so accustomed to the normal way of doing politics and diplomacy are so displaced by Trump that they want to impeach him. You know, I mean, he goes against everything in their core of their being. That's not the way we do things. You know? And you're going against these things. And of course, a businessman's one of the things you brought up, Trump, they keep asking for his income tax returns. I don't know if you follow that. It's become a political issue. Well, there's no requirement for it. And it only became a sort of convention probably 20 years ago. Now, of course, if you're a professional politician, showing your tax returns is not a big thing because you earn from the government and you spend.
You give back to
now, if you're a businessman like Donald Trump, he's got 10,000 partners. Now, I'm a partner with Donald Trump, and I become a target politically because now people see my relationship with him that had been private, has nothing to do with politics, but it becomes politicized. So there's a good reason for him to keep his income tax returns out of the public eye because people might be targeted politically and for no good reason. So there's a lot of things going on with this strange creature that we, will know more about in 50 years perhaps. But I think there may have been some hostility in his thinking towards these kind of being trapped in an agreement that somebody else made. He wants to remake it according to his values, which go against the sort of conventions. And he knows that whatever preceded him, whether it was a deal with Iran, which he said was no good, on his standards, he thinks he can get a better arrangement. Again, the outcome will reveal itself in the future, but I think that is his thinking about it. And he may be right to have stayed out of it. Everyone said, the people involved in the negotiations said it's the best deal we could have gotten. He doesn't believe it. He thinks there's another way to negotiate. Politicians negotiate different, and diplomats negotiate differently than business people. They have skin in the game, we say. When you're used to having skin in the game, that is, you're accountable, you lose money, you lose capital.
But are these diplomats actually representing business people? I mean, they are there negotiating for the business, not for the people.
Diplomats don't, I've never met a diplomat like that. Diplomats represent themselves. They don't even represent their country, they represent themselves. They're self-interested. They're promoting their own career.
I can tell you, I run a multinational company here, a local office of a Belgian multinational company here, and I run so far 3 here, one from US, one from Holland, and one from Belgium, and we never needed any support from any diplomat in order to run business here. Whatever discussion happened with official representative of the countries was always just a waste of time. Nice, have a cocktail. In the best scenario, you meet interesting people, you become friends, you can share a meal, and it's nice when you meet interesting people. But the actual consequences of business were always zero. So I quite doubtful on the function of official representative of countries in supporting business, unless there is sometimes it happens to have someone very dedicated, but is mostly because of the special individual that you meet rather than for a mission. In fact, Italy, a company for which luckily I never had the big responsibility, was used to have next to the embassy the commercial office. Okay, and they decided to shut down because they discovered that they were just a waste of money. And of course, in the Italian way, they were replaced by identical institutions with a different name, because otherwise you have a bunch of unemployed people that you don't know what to do with. Yeah. But at least there was the good thought to shut down these institutions.
No pretense, yeah.
No pretense. Yeah, one more question here, and then
moving away from global countries, let's talk about Southeast Asia. I'm interested to know what can this trade war offer to the development of Southeast Asian nations, such as Vietnam, which is growing pretty much that's growing pretty rapidly, to Malaysia, and to export-oriented industries. Because I think export-oriented industries in the Southeast Asia has indeed benefited from the trade war in the sense that exports have increased. So I think my concern is that what is your opinion on this trade war towards shifting away economic dependency on major economic powers in the world to maybe shifting the focus from that to sustainable export development in such countries?
Yeah, it goes back to the same sort of line of argument that we've been following here. As long as trade relations are based upon politics and diplomacy, it creates barriers and interferences that can be avoided when there's direct relations between individual parties. So I think part of the thing that in order to achieve greater regional interdependency, is to get politics and diplomacy out of the trade game and let people expand the opportunities to trade and discover, what previously were unimaginable opportunities. And they were unimaginable because there was something in the way. So, you have to come through us. We have to be the arbiter, the decider. So, in some ways, it's a simple formula, but it's not easy to implement. It's simple in the sense that, you get the state out of the game, but look at the resistance Donald Trump has run up against, trying to get politics and diplomacy out of the game of trade. There are consequences when you try to do that. But I think the benefits that we've seen up till now are somewhat superficial and are partly invoicing issues, where the Chinese were smart enough to re-invoice points of origin to Vietnam in particular. So Vietnam was but again, this works best where the rule of law and transparency are, where there's less transparency. You can get away with it more easily because you can. But that's okay for me. In a sense, I like the market. I trust the market. The market finds a way because the market's human beings trying to improve their lives. It's humans trying to get away from the obstacles that other people create that are, nobody's injured, if you trade in a voluntary process. And this is where the game should be played, at the human level.
It's interesting to conclude on him, the consideration that he made, because indeed certain difficulties at international level can create opportunities for a more sustainable business model within countries that have been heavily dependent on export, but at the same time do not underestimate the dependence on export, in the sense that for young economies it's normal to be export driven because maybe they can benefit from cheap labor, but they don't have enough internal demand to support growing industries. So it's good to be export driven, and by being export driven they create that purchasing power that allow the internal demand to grow, and therefore to create an internal structure of the economy that is more sustainable. So we don't have to blame necessarily the export-driven model, because for young economies it's like a necessary initial step to create eventually the purchasing power to grow internal demand and therefore to grow more domestically, which is, by the way, the same thing that is happening in China. China is emphasizing more and more on internal demand. So that it is a normal and natural process. The things work together.
But be careful, because the cheap labor argument is very often used as a stick to beat the young economies with. Saying, oh, you're winning because of cheap. Well, it's not cheap labor, it's a package. China didn't have cheap labor so much as it had abundant labor. And labor that could be, you could get 1 million people overnight, but you could fire 2 million people overnight. So it's flexibility of the labor market. It's not just cheap.
It's a competitive advantage somehow.
And regulations and so on. So there's a lot more in it than just cheap labor. It used to be the argument about Japan. Japan, oh, you have cheap labor. That was a way to keep Japanese imports out of America.
Taiwan.
And the Japanese said, leave us alone. We're not cheap. It's the Koreans. Blame. So cheap labor has always been a sort of a stick to beat your opponent with. But it's labor market flexibility, which is a good thing.
Now we have the same problem in the US that has a cheaper labor than Europe, by the way. Last question?
I think throughout the discussion you've been kind of against redistributive policies. I just have a question. I want to know your comment on redistribution in Scandinavian countries, because it seems to have benefited Scandinavian society. I mean, it appears to have. And a lot of Scandinavians credit this to progressive taxation and subsidies of domestic industry. So, what are your comments on redistribution in this aspect?
Redistribution as a political game probably works best in a community with a homogeneous culture, because the redistribution is to people who are like you. So in a way it becomes more like a community. Like, I'm helping my neighbor and he has the same values as I do, and he has the same. So Scandinavia had that advantage at one time and it's lost it. It's no longer as homogeneous. I mean, you say a place like Sweden. And this is cultural as well as religious. The Lutheran mentality in Sweden was such that nobody would game the system to get more. Now that doesn't happen in places with lots of different cultures and backgrounds where, if you try that in Latin America, everybody would be cheating. But there, it was a matter of honor, dignity, community commitment, and so on. So it works, it seems to work better. Now what happened over time, to Sweden in particular, Sweden went from being at the top of the economic performers to much lower. So they've abandoned a lot of that. They've moved away from their social democratic model because they found that the loss of the homogeneity and the sheer expense, it becomes this open-ended commitment that you never stop, this redistributive process, and it comes at the cost of your capacity to continue redistributing, because if you don't have growth and you've got increasing demands for those resources, you wind up being like Venezuela or Argentina, where the economy collapses because the weight of the state obligations and the tax obligations suppresses the ability of the private sector to provide it. Because ultimately, only the private sector can create jobs. Only the private sector can create income and wealth. The government can only create tax obligations. When you create a job in the state, it's a tax obligation. It's not a net benefit. Somebody has to pay it. And it may be him. I can't hire him because my taxes are so high, I can't afford to hire him. So he lost his job in order to create that one. So Sweden, or Scandinavia in general, now Norway's a different story. They have offshore oil. Money for nothing. They can play that game. Okay? They play it a little bit less openly now because oil price has been driven down. It becomes harder. Eventually, that sort of the process, the problems with the process may only reveal themselves later. But ultimately, what we'll see, and we're seeing this in Sweden and Scandinavia in general, the divisiveness is beginning to sneak in. The political divide. Because I'm the taker and I want more and you won't give it. And I'm the maker, you're wasting it. I don't want to give more. So we resent one another, politically or culturally or whatever. So this is, I think the Scandinavian model, they became rich because of free trade. They had to be free traders because they were isolated, tiny little economies. So they had to sell to other people. They became rich enough to do stupid things. And as the demand for more stupid things grew, the burden became unsupportable and they moved away. So if you go, Sweden had social democrats running the country for almost 50 years and they were thrown out of office. And then in order to regain political power, they had to become less social democrat. They became more like the conservative parties there. So it takes time sometimes. It takes decades for these sort of, it's in a way like communism. The contradictions of Marxism, Leninism, it took 70 years before they collapsed under their own weight. The disastrous logic of pursuing those sorts of, that class struggle, that absence of private property, the destruction of incentives for people to be productive and
human lives
and to value one another. It's only in the market that I learned to value you as a human being because I need you. I need you to respect my property rights. I need you to be a customer. I need you to be a supporter in the things that I value in the community. What happened in the Scandinavian model is that it diluted the human need of other humans because the state stood instead. And that's a disaster. We need to have a system where we value each other as other human beings, not as an instrument to promote our lives, which is what redistribution does. You make a lot of money. I want some of yours. So,
okay, so there are no more questions. I thanks for your presence. Of course, I thanks Chris for his presence. Please. Here there is still the sheet where you can put your name and your data if you want to be contacted in the future. There are some copies of the first edu paper if you want to take. Feel free. Of course, I thanks Ali and Ideas for the support. And generously, Ali and Ideas are offering us a refreshment.
Not me, Ideas. I'm not paying.
You're not serving?
I will serve, but I'm not paying.
Ideas is offering a little refreshment outside, so we can continue a little bit the discussion over a light meal.
And I'll be able to, I'll give you my email address.
To sign autographs.
No. Thank you so much.
Do we want to take a picture, a group picture?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah? Maybe if you want, we can take a group picture for this first event.
We'll go to Ali's end of the table, maybe it's best.
Okay, but without disclaimer.
Yeah.
Sure, I can take it out. Can you just help me?